I was running down the hospital corridor, my world already in ruins. My husband was critical. I could taste metal in my mouth from how hard I was breathing. The fluorescent lights smeared into white streaks above me as I sprinted toward the ICU doors. The second my hand touched the cold metal handle, a young doctor's grip clamped around my arm. "Hide!" he whispered urgently, eyes burning into mine. "And trust me." He pulled me back, steering me toward a small door opposite the ICU. I slipped into the darkness, held my breath, and 5 minutes later, through a crack no wider than a fingertip, I saw it. Before the story really begins, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow so I can bring you even more intense stories like the one you're about to hear. Now, back to that night. My phone had been vibrating on the bedside table, buzzing across the wood until it nearly fell. It was almost 11 at night. I was on the couch pretending to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the clock. David, my husband, still wasn't home from what he'd called an emergency meeting with a big client. I grabbed the phone, hoping to see his name and hear his voice say, "I'm on my way, babe." Instead, the screen showed an unknown number. A cold, crawling dread climbed up my spine. I answered with a hesitant hello. "Is this Mrs. Anna Miller, wife of David Miller?" The voice was calm, professional, icy. "Yes, this is Anna. What's wrong?" My heart started pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. "This is Central General Hospital. We need you to come immediately. Your husband has been in a car accident. His condition is critical." The word critical smashed into me. The book slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a soft thud that sounded like an explosion in my ears. For a moment, I couldn't move. Critical. Accident. The words spun around, refusing to settle into anything real. This had to be a nightmare. I bit my lower lip hard enough to draw blood just to prove it wasn't. Reality slammed back in. I launched myself off the couch. Keys, wallet, headscarf. I stumbled into the bedroom, snatching a simple headscarf from the hook with shaking fingers. The pin jabbed my finger, but I barely felt it. I yanked open drawers, grabbed my bag and car keys, and ran out of the apartment still wearing my faded house dress. The night air outside was sharp and icy, biting my bare ankles as I sprinted to the parking garage. In the car, my hands trembled so badly I missed the keyhole twice. "Calm down, Anna, calm down," I muttered, even as panic strangled me. I finally started the engine and drove like a madwoman through half-empty streets. City lights smeared into streaks through the windshield, distorted by tears that wouldn't stop coming. Under my breath, I prayed over and over, "God, please save David. Don't take him. We've just started. We still have so many plans." The radio was off. The only sounds were the engine's drone and my ragged sobs. My mind flashed back to that morning, David straightening his tie, smiling as he told me Brian, his best friend and business partner, had just landed a huge deal and that we'd celebrate that night. Central General rose ahead of me like a massive white block, cold and imposing. I abandoned the car by the emergency entrance, ignoring the security guard yelling after me. The lobby was blindingly bright, smelling of antiseptic and floor cleaner, a sterile smell that made me nauseous. "ICU! Where's the ICU?" I half yelled at the nurse at the reception desk. She stared at my wild eyes and disheveled scarf with pity. "5th floor, ma'am. Take the elevator. But visiting hours are..." I was already running. In the elevator, each second stretched into an hour. When the doors finally opened, the corridor felt eerily quiet, painted a pale green that was supposed to be calming, but only made my fear worse. I saw it right away, the big glass doors with ICU printed above them. Through the glass, I could see rows of beds, monitors blinking, nurses gliding around like ghosts. On one of the room doors hung a chart with a name, David Miller. My knees nearly buckled. He was in there, fighting for his life. I had to see him, to hold his hand, to tell him I was there. I forced my body forward, hand outstretched to push open the heavy glass. That was when a strong hand clamped around my forearm, making me gasp. I spun around. A young man in a white coat stood behind me. Thin-framed glasses, dark circles under intense eyes. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked, softly but firmly. I could only nod, too stunned to speak. His gaze flicked down the corridor, checking that no one was watching, then returned to me. His grip tightened, as if afraid I would bolt. "Don't go in," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but there was steel in it. "Whatever happens, do not let anyone know you're here tonight." Confusion briefly outpaced my terror. "What?" "My husband is in there. I need to see him." I tried to yank my arm back, but he didn't let go. "My name is Dr. Harris. I'm a resident here. There's no time to explain. See that door?" He pointed to a scuffed wooden door opposite the ICU. "Utility closet. Hide in there, now." "You're insane. I'm not hiding while my husband—" "If you want your husband to live, you'll do what I say." The cold, fierce certainty in his tone cut through my panic like a knife. "They'll be here any minute. Hide. Don't make a sound. Whatever you see or hear, do not come out." "They who?" I whispered, but he didn't answer. He guided, almost pushed me toward the closet. My heart hammered so hard my chest hurt. Some instinct, or maybe the desperate look in his eyes, convinced me. He cracked the door open. The smell of mop water and strong chemicals rushed out. The tiny room was pitch black. "Inside," he ordered. I stepped backward into the darkness, feeling like I was climbing into a coffin. He left the door almost shut, leaving a hair-thin gap, just enough for me to press my eye to it. "Don't move," he whispered one last time. The door clicked softly and I was alone. The darkness swallowed me whole. I held my breath, listening. All I could hear at first was the pounding of my own heart and the faint hum of hospital machines through the walls. Dust tickled my nose. I fought the urge to cough. Through the narrow gap I could see a sliver of polished floor and pale green wall. 1 minute crawled by. Nothing. Maybe he really was crazy. I should be at David's side, not hiding in a closet like a coward. Another minute. The cold seeped into my bones. By the 3rd minute, I thought I heard the elevator chime in the distance. Footsteps or imagination? The 4th minute stretched until doubt gnawed at me. This was ridiculous. I was Anna Miller, a terrified wife, hiding among mops while my husband hovered between life and death because some stranger told me to. I braced myself to push the door open. Exactly 5 minutes after I'd been shoved inside, I heard them clearly. Footsteps. Not the hurried, chaotic footsteps of nurses in an emergency, but measured, calm, confident. 2 sets. They came from the direction of the elevator. I stopped breathing. 2 silhouettes entered my tiny field of vision and stopped in front of David's ICU room. Even in profile, I recognized them. One was a broad-shouldered older doctor I'd seen in hospital brochures and on plaques. Dr. Blake, head of the ICU, the man everyone said you wanted in charge when things went wrong. The other made my blood run cold. Brian, David's best friend and business partner, practically a brother to him and to me. For a split second, relief flared. Of course Brian was here. He loved David. But something was wrong. He didn't look devastated. He didn't look anxious. His normally warm face was stiff, his eyes hard and calculating. He scanned the empty hallway, gaze sweeping dangerously close to my hiding place. I instinctively pulled back a fraction, praying he wouldn't sense me watching. Dr. Blake swiped his keycard and the ICU door sighed open. Both men slipped into David's room. The door shut again, and the corridor returned to its oppressive silence. My legs shook so badly I had to lean against the wall. Why was Brian here with the head of the ICU? And why did Dr. Harris want me hidden from them? I couldn't stand not knowing. I eased the door open another inch, careful to avoid any sound. The gap widened enough for me to see David's door clearly. Its central panel was frosted glass, so I couldn't see details, only blurred shapes. 2 tall silhouettes stood at his bedside. Then I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. Dr. Blake lifted a syringe, its barrel glinting under the harsh fluorescent light. The liquid inside wasn't clear. It was cloudy, milky. He didn't inject it into David's arm. He pushed the needle into the IV bag, hanging above the bed, and slowly depressed the plunger. The poison disappeared into the fluid that was feeding directly into my husband's veins. Brian just stood there, watching, making no move to stop him. Then Brian pulled a thick envelope, more like a small leather wallet, from his jacket and handed it to Dr. Blake. The doctor slid it into his coat pocket with a brief nod, as if they'd just completed a routine transaction. I slapped both hands over my mouth to strangle the scream rising in my chest. My knees gave out and I sank onto the closet floor among filthy mops and buckets. My mind scrambled for any other explanation. Maybe it was some special medication. Maybe the envelope held consent forms or private paperwork. Maybe... Then Dr. Harris's warning echoed in my head. Hide and trust me. If this were harmless, why did he need me hidden? Why had his eyes been full of real fear? Through the crack, I watched the door open again. Dr. Blake and Brian stepped into the corridor. "Make sure the dosage works exactly as planned," Brian murmured, his voice carrying down the eerily quiet hallway. "I don't want any mistakes." "Relax, Mr. Carter," Dr. Blake replied evenly. "In 12 hours, his heart will fail. Complications from trauma. No one will suspect a thing." "Good. Remember our agreement," Brian said. "As soon as it's over, the rest of your payment is transferred." "Understood." They walked toward the elevator like two businessmen leaving a boardroom, not like a friend and a doctor who'd just signed my husband's death warrant. The elevator doors slid shut behind them with a soft chime. Something inside me snapped. The shock, the disbelief, all of it burned away, leaving something cold and razor-sharp. Rage. My blood stopped freezing and started boiling. A moment later, the utility closet door opened. The sudden light stabbed my eyes. Dr. Harris stood there, face pale, jaw clenched. He saw me on the floor shaking, not from fear anymore, but from fury. You heard?" he asked quietly. I couldn't answer. My throat felt raw. I just stared up at him, my eyes dry because I'd already cried everything I had. He helped me to my feet and guided me to a shadowed corner of the corridor away from the nurse's station. "He's going to kill my husband," I finally rasped. "Brian, his own best friend, and that doctor, he's just doing it for money." Dr. Harris nodded, guilt clouding his gaze. "I've suspected something was wrong for months," he said. "Since I started here, I've seen a pattern. Wealthy patients with complicated but survivable conditions suddenly crashing in the ICU. Always under Dr. Blake, always with the same explanation: unexpected heart failure. He told me about an elderly heiress who'd come in with a broken hip, recovered well after surgery, then died overnight in the ICU from cardiac complications. Her heirs had seemed a little too relieved. Then a businessman with a mild stroke, stable and expected to recover, suddenly dying 3 days after Blake took over his case. "I didn't have proof," Harris said. "Just a sick feeling. Then your husband came in. I saw his initial ER report. Bad injuries, yes. Broken ribs, a concussion, some internal bleeding. But nothing that should have killed a healthy man his age. He was stabilizing. He should have been waking up by now. Instead, Blake rushed him to the ICU and locked down visiting hours." His jaw tightened. It didn't add up. "And the crash?" I whispered. The idea felt too monstrous to say out loud, but it was already growing like poison inside me. "I'm almost certain it was staged," Harris said grimly. "Your husband was lured into a predictable route at a predictable time. All they needed was one accident to bring him here, into Blake's territory, where they control the drugs, the data, the access. Here they can kill and call it medicine." My mind flashed back to the cloudy liquid in the syringe, to Brian's cold eyes. "What did he inject?" I asked. "Some kind of slow-acting poison," Harris replied. "From what I saw, I'd bet on a high dose of succinylcholine, a muscle relaxant that paralyzes every muscle, including the ones you need to breathe, but leaves the brain awake. Hard to detect in an autopsy if you don't look for it. In 12 hours, they'd call it heart failure. You'd be a grieving widow, and Brian would be the loyal friend arranging the funeral." I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. "We can't let that happen." "I'm glad you said that," Harris replied, eyes flashing. "Because I can't do this alone. Blake is the god of this unit. Brian is rich and connected. They'll crush a hysterical wife and a junior doctor unless we have hard evidence." He pulled 2 small objects from his pocket, a fresh, sterile syringe, and a tiny digital recorder no bigger than the tip of my thumb. The weight of them felt enormous in his open palm. "We need 2 things," he said. "Proof of what they're using on your husband, and proof that they're doing it on purpose. I can handle the lab work if we can get a sample, but I can't be the one sneaking around his room. I'd be noticed immediately. You, on the other hand, you're his wife. You're supposed to be desperate." He pressed the recorder into my hand. "This is voice activated. I need you to slip into David's room. Hide this somewhere they won't see it. Under the bed frame, behind a monitor, anywhere. Then..." He tapped the syringe. "You'll draw a small sample from his IV bag, just a milliliter, enough to test." I stared at him, the corridor tilting slightly. "Now?" "The nurses are right there." "I'll create a distraction," Harris said. "Something big enough to pull every nurse in the unit away for a few minutes. When you hear the code blue alarm, you move, in and out. Plant the recorder, take the sample, and get back to the closet. Don't talk to anyone. Don't hesitate. And whatever you do, don't get caught with that syringe in your hand." He gripped my shoulders. "If Blake or his people see you, they'll say you're crazy, that you tried to hurt your own husband. They'll sedate you, lock you away, and finish what they started with David. Do you understand?" Terror crawled up my spine, but behind it burned something stronger. The image of David smiling that morning, and the thought of him lying alone in a bed while his friend bought his death. "I understand," I said. "I'll do it." Harris exhaled, relieved. "Back into the closet," he whispered. "Wait for the alarm. You'll hear code blue, room 509. That's my signal." He slid the syringe and recorder into the pocket of my house dress. They felt cold against my skin. "I'll lead the response team myself. I'll keep everyone busy as long as I can. Don't waste it." I slipped back into the dark closet. This time the darkness felt less like a coffin and more like a hiding place I chose. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The unit hummed with quiet activity, soft voices, rolling carts, beeping machines. Time stretched. I counted slow breaths to keep from shaking apart. Then the shrill clang of an alarm ripped through the silence. "Code blue, room 509. Code blue, room 509. Room 509 was at the far end of the hall, opposite David's. Immediately, the corridor exploded into motion. Footsteps thundered past my door. "Get the crash cart! Defib's coming!" Voices grew louder, then faded as everyone rushed toward the code. The nurses' station fell silent. I cracked the door and peeked. Empty. This was my chance. Heart slamming against my ribs, I slipped out and walked, fast, not quite running, toward David's room. His name on the door hit me like a punch. I pushed the door open. Inside, the smell of antiseptic was stronger. The only sound was the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. David lay motionless on the bed, pale as the sheets, head wrapped in a bandage, a thin oxygen tube under his nose. For a heartbeat, I froze. He looked like he was sleeping, but there was a stillness about him that hurt to see. "Focus, Anna," I whispered to myself. I knelt beside the bed and groped under the frame until my fingers found a flat metal beam near the wall, out of sight unless you were searching. I pressed the recorder's tiny button, slid it into place, and stuck it there, one part done. My hands shook as I turned to the IV pole. The bag looked completely normal, clear fluid dripping slowly through the tubing into my husband's body. Knowing what had been injected into it made me want to tear the whole thing down, but I forced myself to follow the plan. I pulled the syringe from my pocket, unwrapped it, and found the small rubber port on the IV line. "Forgive me, love," I whispered. I swabbed the port with the alcohol pad Harris had tucked into my pocket, then pushed the needle into the rubber. It resisted, then gave way. I pulled back the plunger. Clear fluid filled the barrel. Just a tiny amount, but enough. My fingers pressed so hard they hurt as I withdrew the needle and capped it. I had the poison in my hand. I should have left immediately, but I couldn't. I stood there, staring at David's face. He looked so fragile. The anger, the fear, the love, all of it crashed over me at once. I reached out and stroked his cheek, cool under my fingers. "I'm here," I whispered, voice breaking. "I know what they're doing. I won't let them win. Just hold on. Please, David, hold on." I bent to kiss his forehead and heard the faintest sound. A tiny, strangled groan, barely more than air. My breath caught. His eyes remained shut, his body still. But from the corner of his closed eye, a single tear slid down, slowly tracing a path along his temple into his hairline. He was there. He wasn't in a deep coma. He was trapped inside his own body, able to hear me, but unable to move. "David," I breathed. His lashes trembled, but his eyelids stayed shut. Another tear welled and spilled. I wanted to shake him, to scream, but voices echoed in the corridor. "False alarm! The monitor glitched again!" "Reset it and log it." Footsteps approached. Panic stabbed through me. I forced myself away from the bed, clutching the syringe. I cracked the door just enough to see the hall. Nurses were drifting back to their station, grumbling about lost sleep. I slipped out the moment their backs were turned and hurried to the utility closet, shutting myself inside just as they rounded the corner. I leaned against the door, my whole body trembling. But this time, the shaking wasn't just from fear. The image of David's tear burned behind my eyes. He'd heard me. He knew I was there. While they slowly poisoned him, he'd been locked in that body, listening, feeling everything. It wasn't just murder. It was torture. I gripped the syringe so tightly the plastic creaked. I had evidence now, but I was still stuck in the dark while his killers roamed the halls. I had to get the sample to Harris. I listened until the sounds outside settled back into routine hospital noise. Then I heard measured steps I was beginning to recognize. Peeking through the crack, I saw Dr. Harris approaching the nurse's station with a chart in hand. "I'm just going to check on Mr. Miller in 507, he told the nurse casually. "Make sure his vitals are stable after that alarm." "Of course, doctor," she replied, barely looking up. He went into David's room, stayed a short while, then emerged, closing the door gently. He returned to the nurse's station. "He's stable," he announced. Then he did something clever. He picked up a paper cup, walked over to the water dispenser right beside the utility closet, and accidentally spilled it all over the floor. "Oh no," he said loudly. "Sorry, this is going to be slippery." "It's okay, doctor. I'll call housekeeping," the nurse said. "No need," Harris replied. "There's a mop in the utility closet right here. I'll grab it." That was my signal. He turned his back to the nurses, blocking their view of the door. He knocked lightly. "Housekeeping," he said in a deliberately casual tone, then cracked the door open a few inches. I was ready. I pushed the capped syringe, still wrapped in its plastic, into his waiting hand. He moved with practiced ease, slipping it into his coat pocket in a single smooth motion. "The sample," I whispered. "And Harris, he's conscious. David, he can hear." He cried. Harris's shoulders tensed. Even from behind I could feel his shock. "My God," he breathed under his breath. "That changes everything. This isn't just murder, it's torture." He cleared his throat, then raised his voice again. "Ah, here's the mop," he called out, pretending to retrieve something from inside, though he barely opened the door further. To me, in a rapid whisper, he said, "I have to get this to a private lab right now. I can't trust the hospitals. I'm leaving the building. You need to get out too, without anyone noticing you came from here. Go home. Change out of that nightdress, wash your face, then come back in the morning like a wife who's just arrived after a terrifying call." "And then what?" I breathed. "Then you play dumb," he said. "Ask about his condition. Ask for Dr. Blake. If Brian shows up, talk to him too, but don't accuse him yet. We have the how. We still need the why. I'll try to monitor from a distance. The recorder under the bed will capture anything they say when they think they're alone." He shut the door, actually mopped up the spilled water, and returned the mop, leaving the door slightly ajar for me. Then I heard his phone ring loudly. "What? A pileup in the ER?" he said, voice urgent. "I'm on my way." Chairs scraped as he and several nurses rushed toward the elevator, the unit thrown into motion again. That was my second opening. I slipped out, head down, walking quickly toward the far elevator. At the nurses' station, they were too busy on the phone with the ER to look my way. I stabbed the elevator button with a shaking finger. When the doors closed around me, I sagged against the wall, dizzy with exhaustion and adrenaline. I had the sample in safe hands. David was still alive and fighting, but for now, I had to leave him behind enemy lines. The early morning air outside the hospital slapped me awake. Everything felt colder, sharper. I walked like a ghost to my car, got in, and just sat there for a long moment staring up at the building that no longer felt like a place of healing but a nest of predators. Eventually I drove home. I don't remember the route. One moment I was in the hospital parking lot. The next I was pulling into our apartment garage. Inside, Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The book on the floor, David's half-empty mug on the coffee table, his jacket on the hook. Ordinary life, frozen in time. I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror. A woman with red-rimmed eyes, a crooked scarf, and a twisted house dress. I looked like a victim, but I refused to be one. I stepped into the shower and turned the water as cold as I could stand. The icy stream shocked my system, rinsing away the hospital smell and some of the panic. I scrubbed my skin until it was pink, as if I could wash off the touch of death. When I stepped out, my thoughts were clearer. I didn't reach for comfortable clothes. I chose my best work blouse, tailored pants, and a fresh, neatly pressed headscarf. I covered the dark circles under my eyes with makeup. If I was going to play the role of grieving wife tomorrow, I wanted to look composed, not broken. Behind the mask, I would be something else entirely, an investigator and, if necessary, an executioner. Dawn light seeped through the curtains. It was 6 a.m. Harris had told me to come back at 8. He was working on the poison. I needed the motive. Brian's unfinished sentence from the hallway echoed in my head. Remember our agreement. The rest of your payment will be transferred. Money. It had to be money. I remembered how tense David had been the past few weeks. All the late nights hunched over his laptop after coming home. Every time I asked, he'd smiled and brushed it off. Just work stuff. Brian landed a big project. We have to make sure everything's perfect. Had that project been real or a cover? I went to David's desk and pulled out the spare office key card he kept there. The sign on his key ring read Brightline Ventures, the company he and Brian co-owned. I made a decision. I wouldn't go straight back to the hospital. First, I'd go to David's office. The business district was just waking up, people rushing with coffee cups and laptops, unaware that somewhere among them walked a woman whose life had been blown apart overnight. The lobby guard at Brightline looked startled to see me so early. "Mrs. Miller, here to see Mr. David?" he asked gently. The sympathy in his eyes told me he already knew about the accident. "Yes," I said, letting my voice tremble. "I heard about the crash. I need to pick up some of his personal documents for the insurance." The lie slipped out easier than I liked. He hesitated only a second before nodding and buzzing me through. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I hope he pulls through." "Thank you," I whispered, and walked into the quiet office. David's glass-walled office in the corner looked untouched. His chair, his papers, the photo of us on our wedding day, smiling like the future could only ever be kind. My throat tightened, but I pushed the emotion down. I sat in his chair, which still felt faintly like him, and powered on his computer. The login screen blinked, demanding a password. I tried our anniversary date, wrong. My birthday, wrong. His birthday, wrong. I leaned back, staring at the screen. What would David use? Something personal, something only we would understand. My mind drifted to the silly nickname he'd given me when we were first dating. Evening Glow, because he said I made even the ugliest day look beautiful when the sun went down. It was embarrassing and sweet and entirely him. I typed, "Evening Glow." The desktop sprang to life. I opened his email. Hundreds of messages, contracts, reports, updates. I typed Brian into the search bar. Dozens of results popped up. Meeting notes, client talks, nothing unusual. My eyes skimmed down the folder list on the side until one label snagged my attention. Personal_draft. I clicked it. There was only one unsent email inside, addressed to their corporate attorney. Subject: Notice of internal audit and termination of partnership. My heart stuttered. I opened it. It was a detailed, formal letter. David wrote that he'd quietly hired an independent auditor to review company finances over the past 2 years. The audit had uncovered serious irregularities, millions of dollars quietly siphoned away from company accounts into shell companies controlled by Brian. The huge project Brian had been talking about didn't exist. It was the cover he'd used to move money around. At the end of the email, dated yesterday morning, David wrote that he'd confronted Brian and given him an ultimatum. Return every stolen dollar within 24 hours, or David would report him to the board and the police and initiate legal proceedings to remove him from the company. 24 hours. The car crash had happened that same night. The accident wasn't random. It was Brian's answer. My stomach churned. But I knew there had to be more. Killing David wouldn't just silence him. It had to benefit Brian financially. I searched David's files for insurance and found a folder labeled Policies. Among them was a recently updated document, Key Person Life Insurance, Partnership. I opened it. If one partner died, the policy would pay out a huge sum and transfer the deceased partner's shares directly to the surviving partner. If David died, Brian wouldn't only avoid prison for embezzlement, he'd inherit the entire company plus a massive insurance payout. He'd be rich, untouchable, and alone at the top. I printed the unsent email and the insurance policy, folded them, and slipped them into my bag. Motivation secured. Harris had the how. Now we had the why. As I was about to shut down the computer, my phone buzzed. Dr. Harris's name lit up the screen. "Anna," he said, voice tight. "I've got the lab results." I held my breath. "And?" "It's as bad as I thought. High-dose succinylcholine, strong enough to paralyze him from head to toe while keeping his brain awake. It breaks down fast, so if we hadn't taken that sample, an autopsy would probably miss it." He paused. "They've been torturing him slowly, letting him feel everything while he can't move." Rage spiked through me again, but before I could say anything, his voice dropped even lower. "There's a bigger problem. The recorder you planted under the bed, I just checked its remote signal. It's dead. Battery wouldn't die this fast. Someone found it and shut it off, or destroyed it. Either way, they know someone's watching." A cold wave washed over me. If they suspected we were onto them, they might speed things up and finish David off right away. "What do we do?" I whispered, glancing at the office clock. 7:50 a.m. "You still have to come," Harris said firmly. "If you don't show up, it confirms their paranoia. You go in exactly as planned. Devastated, confused, asking about your husband. Don't mention the recorder. Don't mention the audit or insurance. I'm already at the hospital watching from a distance. I swapped his main IV bag for saline earlier, but if Blake decides to inject a final dose directly, it won't matter. We're running out of time." He took a breath. "Bring the documents you found. Between those and the lab report, we have enough to draw the police in. All we're missing is catching them in the act. I'm going to push for that. But it's dangerous, Anna. Be ready." The line went dead. I stared at my reflection in David's office window. Same face, new resolve. I shut down his computer, straightened my clothes, and walked out. The lobby guard gave me another sad, pitying look as I passed. If only he knew. The drive back to the hospital felt endless, though traffic crawled as usual. I parked in the visitor lot this time like any normal family member and walked through the main entrance. In daylight, Central General looked less menacing, more ordinary, even welcoming. It was a lie. I rode the elevator up to the 5th floor. When the doors opened, the ICU corridor greeted me again with its too-clean smell and relentless beeping. This time, the nurses' station bustled with activity. I let my shoulders slump and my eyes shine with real exhaustion. I didn't have to fake the grief or the fear. A nurse looked up. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" I'm Anna Miller," I said, letting my voice crack. "My husband, David Miller, he's in 507. Last night they said he was critical. I just need to know if he's okay." The nurse's expression softened. "Mrs. Miller, please have a seat. I'll call Dr. Blake. He's in charge of your husband's care." That twist of dread in my stomach tightened. Of course he was. I stood instead of sitting, staring at David's closed door across the hall. The frosted glass panel seemed to mock me. Was he still alive behind it? Still trapped? Still hearing everything? "Mrs. Miller." I turned. Dr. Blake approached, white coat pristine, expression carefully somber. Up close, he looked exactly like the kind of doctor people trusted with their lives. Calm, competent, compassionate. I now knew better. "I'm so sorry about all this," he said gently. "Why don't we sit down?" "Just tell me," I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "How is he?" He sighed heavily, rehearsed sadness tugging at his features. "I'm afraid his condition worsened overnight. The trauma to his head appears to have triggered serious complications. His heart is showing signs of acute failure. We've given him every medication available, but..." He let the sentence hang. "I don't understand," I said, clinging to my bag strap. Last night, the ER doctor said his injuries were serious but not life-threatening. How does that turn into heart failure in a few hours? Trauma can be unpredictable, Blake replied smoothly. The body sometimes reacts in ways we don't fully understand. Severe stress, hidden damage, all of that can overwhelm the heart. His explanation sounded plausible enough for someone who didn't know what I'd seen. Anna! A new voice cut in, warm, familiar, and now utterly repulsive. I turned to see Brian walking toward us. He looked like the perfect picture of a devastated friend. Eyes red, tie loosened, hair mussed as if he hadn't slept. "You're finally here," he said hoarsely, pulling me into a hug before I could react. Every muscle in my body screamed to shove him away, but I forced myself to stand there, allowing him to hold me. My tears were real, but they weren't for him. "I stayed all night," he murmured. "I couldn't leave him." Liar. I'd watched him walk away from David's bed after injecting poison by proxy. He pulled back, hands on my shoulders, giving me a look of practiced empathy. "You have to stay strong for him," he said. "David needs you." "What really happened, Brian?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yesterday morning he said he needed to talk to you about something important, about an audit at the company." For a second, just one heartbeat, his face froze. The grief mask slipped. His eyes went wide, pupils flaring. That tiny crack exposed the truth. Then fast he recovered, forcing a brittle laugh. "An audit?" he said lightly. "Anna, you must have misheard. He was probably talking about a project. We've had so much going on, it's been crazy. Come on, work stuff doesn't matter right now. Your husband is fighting for his life." He aimed a quick look at Dr. Blake, a flash of panic passing between them. That was all I needed to see. "No," I said, letting a little steel into my tone. "He said audit, and he was serious. He said he'd found something and needed to confront you." "Mrs. Miller," Blake interrupted, voice firmer now. "This is not the time to discuss business matters. You're in shock. It's completely understandable if your memory is confused." He glanced at the nurse's station. "Could someone bring Mrs. Miller some water? And perhaps a mild sedative? She's been through a terrible trauma." They wanted to drug me, to blur my edges and silence my questions. I stepped back, raising my voice. "I don't need a sedative," I snapped. "I need the truth." Blake's eyes narrowed. Brian's earlier softness disappeared, replaced by something colder. They exchanged another quick, loaded glance. "She knows something," Blake muttered under his breath, not quite quiet enough. "So what?" Brian replied, also low but perfectly audible in the tense silence of the corridor. "We can't take the risk. Finish it. Give him the last dose. Call it a massive arrest. Blame the stress." The words slammed into me like a freight train. Everything else fell away. "No!" I screamed before I could stop myself. The sound ricocheted off the sterile walls. Nurses at the station jerked their heads up. Families in the waiting area peered around the corner. Brian and Blake spun to face me, surprise flickering across their faces. "Anna, calm down," Brian said, reaching for my arm again, his voice sliding back into that soothing, false concern. I jerked away. "Don't touch me," I spat. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care who saw. "You're going to kill him, both of you. You're murderers." Blake's mask cracked. "Mrs. Miller, you're hysterical," he snapped. "You're disrupting the ICU. Security." "Go ahead, call them," I yelled, stepping backward so everyone in the hallway could hear. "Call security, call the police, call whoever you want. Then we can all talk about how my husband's best friend hired you to poison him." The corridor went dead quiet. "What are you talking about?" Brian hissed, his face draining of color. I didn't look at him. I looked straight at Blake. "Suits you, doesn't it? Succinylcholine. Fast-acting muscle paralytic, hard to detect after death. That's what you've been injecting into your patients' IVs, isn't it?" For a moment, all the blood drained from his face. The name hit him like a slap. It was too specific, too accurate to be a wild guess from a distraught wife. Fear flashed deep in his eyes before he buried it under rage. "You stupid woman," he whispered. "You have no idea what you're getting into." "She knows too much," he hissed to Brian, louder now. "We don't have a choice." Brian's expression hardened into something predator-sharp. "Then handle it," he said flatly. "Do it now." What happened next moved faster than thought. In blind panic, Blake reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a syringe already loaded with cloudy fluid, the same poison he'd put into David's drip. He didn't run toward David's room, and he lunged at me. "She attacked me!" he shouted, twisting the story before it even happened. Nurses gasped. Brian stepped back, watching. If Blake killed me here with that needle, he'd claim he'd been defending himself from a crazed family member. David would be left helpless. The truth would die with me. I flinched back against the wall, throwing up my arms as the needle arced toward me. "Police! Don't move!" The shout detonated through the corridor. It wasn't Harris's voice. I opened my eyes. 2 uniformed officers were racing toward us from the elevator, guns drawn. Behind them, breathless but blazing with determination, was Dr. Harris. Blake froze mid-lunge, the syringe inches from my skin. "Drop the needle!" one officer barked. Hands trembling, Blake loosened his grip. The syringe clattered to the floor, its contents splashing harmlessly across the linoleum. The other officer pivoted just in time to see Brian spin toward the stairwell door. He tackled him hard, slamming him to the ground before he could escape. Brian howled, cursing, struggling against the officer's weight. Cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. The first officer kicked the syringe aside, then spun Blake around, wrenching his arms behind his back. "You're under arrest," he said. Blake sagged, as if his bones had evaporated. His pristine white coat suddenly looked like a costume. I slid down the wall, my legs unable to hold me. Harris rushed to my side, kneeling. "Anna, are you hurt?" I shook my head, pointing desperately toward David's room. "David," I croaked. "Please." Harris understood. He surged to his feet and sprinted into 507. I watched the door close behind him, my heart pounding in my throat. In the hallway, Brian kept protesting, voice climbing in pitch. "That doctor's insane. He's framing me. I tried to help David. I stayed all night." "Save it for your lawyer," the officer muttered, hauling him upright. A moment later, the ICU door opened again. Harris stepped out, supporting someone who looked like they'd been pulled from the grave. Thin, pale, in a hospital gown, oxygen tube dangling uselessly from his nose. David. He was standing, leaning heavily on Harris, but standing. His eyes were open, burning with a fury I'd never seen before. The entire corridor went silent. Nurses, patients' relatives, even the cops froze. David took a shaky step forward, still gripping Harris's arm, and stared straight at Brian. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge anyone else. His entire world narrowed to the man in handcuffs. His voice, when it came, was raspy and raw from disuse, but clear enough to cut through stone. "You," he hissed, "you betrayed me." Brian's eyes went wide as if he'd seen a ghost. As far as he'd known, David had been locked in his own body, drifting toward a natural death. Seeing him upright and speaking shattered whatever composure Brian had left. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, no excuses left to give. It was the final blow. His shoulders slumped as the officers dragged him away. Later, after the chaos settled, David was moved to a private room in another wing, far from the ICU Blake had ruled over. Harris hung a new IV bag, saline and vitamins, nothing else. David lay back, utterly spent, his hand limp in mine but his breathing steady. "You saved him," I said to Harris, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," he replied. "We saved him. You, me, and David himself." I frowned. "How did you get the police here in time?" Harris sank into a chair, looking suddenly older than his years. "When the lab confirmed succinylcholine," he said, "I knew we had proof of murder, but the dead recorder told me they knew something was up. I didn't trust hospital security. Blake owned this place, so I drove straight to the central police station with the lab report." "They didn't believe you at first, I guessed." He gave a humorless smile. "Not exactly. They thought I was a junior doctor with a grudge against my boss, but I refused to leave. I yelled in the lobby. I showed them the report. I told them a man was being murdered in a hospital bed as we spoke. Eventually, a detective listened. He saw the data and decided it was too specific to ignore. He sent 2 officers back with me, quietly, no sirens. We took the service entrance, came up the stairs, and arrived just in time to hear you shouting about audits and succinylcholine." He shook his head. "Your scream probably saved your life. It gave us probable cause to move in when we saw him coming at you with that syringe." "And David?" I asked softly. "How did he stand up?" Harris's eyes softened. Last night, after you took the sample, I went back in. I couldn't safely swap the whole bag, too risky, but I clamped the IV tubing so the poison would drip in painfully slowly. It bought us time. When I ran into his room with the police, I immediately disconnected what was left and injected an antidote, neostigmine, to counteract the muscle paralysis. It doesn't fix everything, but it gives the body a fighting chance to move again. I expected him to wiggle a finger, maybe open his eyes. He glanced at David, awe in his expression. Instead, he hauled himself up and walked. David's eyes opened. He'd been listening. Not walked, he croaked, staggered. His lips twitched in a faint smile. Then his face sobered. From the moment of the crash, it wasn't an accident, Anna. His gaze went distant. I saw the SUV in my rearview mirror. It sped up, clipped my back bumper, pushed the car toward the guardrail. When I glanced over, I saw Brian behind the wheel. Then, chaos. Metal. Airbags. Darkness. He swallowed. I woke up in the ER, couldn't move much, but I could talk a little. Then they moved me to the ICU. I heard Brian's voice. He sounded relieved. Then Blake's. They talked like I wasn't there. And then something went into my IV. I felt it. Cold. And suddenly, I couldn't move at all. He shuddered. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't speak. But I could hear everything. He continued. I heard them bargain over my life like it was a business deal. How soon I'd crash. How clean it would look. I heard Brian set a price. I heard Blake agree to make my death look like a complication. Then Brian left. Blake stayed. I lay there, trapped, listening to my own heartbeat on the monitor, waiting for it to stop. He blinked hard. I screamed in my head until I thought I'd go insane. Then you came. His eyes met mine, shining. You touched me, you talked to me, and I threw everything I had left into that one tear, hoping you'd see it, hoping you'd know I was still there. That kept me fighting. A knock interrupted us. The detective Harris had mentioned stepped in, holding a folder thick with papers. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, Dr. Harris, he said, I won't take much of your time. We'll need formal statements later, but right now I need any evidence you have. I opened my bag with trembling fingers and handed over the printed email draft and the Keyman insurance policy. He scanned them quickly, eyebrows climbing. Embezzlement, secret audit, massive insurance payout, he muttered. Plus a paralyzed victim who heard everything, a tainted IV sample, and 2 suspects caught red-handed, one threatening a witness with a loaded syringe. He closed the folder with a decisive snap. This isn't just attempted murder. It's organized, premeditated crime. I can promise you this. Those 2 won't be seeing the outside of a cell for a very long time. 6 months later, the case was the trial of the year. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, cameras flashing as we walked in. David no longer needed a wheelchair, just a cane for longer distances. Every step he took up the aisle was a victory over the venom they'd pumped into him. I walked beside him, head high, and Dr. Harris followed, suit neat, face calm. At the defense table sat Brian and Dr. Blake. Brian still wore an expensive suit, but it hung looser on him now, like his body had shrunk under the weight of what he'd done. Dark circles framed his eyes. He avoided looking at us. Blake, on the other hand, looked decades older. His shoulders bowed. His guilt reputation was gone, stripped away in headlines and internal investigations. One by one, we took the stand. Harris went first, explaining the science calmly, laying out each step like a clinical case report. The pattern of suspicious deaths under Blake's care, the succinylcholine results, the IV clamp, the antidote. The prosecutor then called in expert witnesses about the drug and investigators who dug into old ICU records. 5 earlier complication deaths, all wealthy patients with heirs who stood to gain, now looked sinister. When I testified, I told the story from my side. The late-night phone call, the dash to the hospital, Harris dragging me into the utility closet, watching Brian hand over an envelope after the poison injection, sneaking into David's room, stealing the sample, seeing his tear. I described finding the audit email and the insurance policy. The defense tried to paint me as an unstable, emotional spouse. I stared them down. The hardest testimony came from David. He insisted on walking to the stand without help. The courtroom was so quiet when he began speaking that you could hear a pen drop. He described confronting Brian about the missing money, the ultimatum, and the way Brian had promised to make it right. He described the crash. Then he described the ICU, lying in a body that wouldn't respond, hearing the person he'd trusted most in the world casually negotiate his death. "You didn't just try to kill me," he said, looking straight at Brian. "You turned my body into a prison and left me there to hear you selling my life like a commodity. The crash hurt. Your betrayal hurt more." Even some of the jurors looked shaken. Faced with the mounting evidence and the prospect of a death sentence, Blake broke. He fired his attorneys mid-trial and chose to testify for the prosecution in exchange for life in prison instead of execution. On the stand, his confession was brutal. He admitted to poisoning David on Brian's request and to accepting large sums of money for 5 previous accidents. He described how Brian had approached him, offered an obscene amount of money to quietly manage his partner's death so it looked natural, and how greed had drowned out whatever conscience he had left. Brian exploded, leaping from his chair and lunging at Blake, screaming that he was a liar. Bailiffs tackled him. The mask he'd worn for years shattered completely, showing the vicious, panicked man beneath. In the end, the judge's ruling was swift and unforgiving. Dr. Blake received life in prison without the possibility of parole. His medical license was permanently revoked. His name was stricken from every plaque on the hospital walls. Brian was convicted on multiple counts: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, massive embezzlement, and causing the crash that nearly killed David. He was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Every asset he'd hidden or flaunted was seized to repay what he'd stolen. When they led him away in chains, he shouted about injustice, about how it had all been a misunderstanding. No one listened. Justice, for once, had sharp teeth. Months passed. The media frenzy died down. The hospital replaced its leadership and launched a thorough overhaul. David went through physical therapy, slowly rebuilding muscle and confidence. The scars on his body faded, but the scars in his mind took longer. We moved out of the apartment that had watched our world shatter and bought a small house on the edge of town, a place with a tiny garden and a wide porch where the evenings were quiet. One late afternoon, I was watering rose bushes as the sky turned a soft gold. David sat in a wicker chair with a book, his cane leaning nearby. He moved more easily now, only needing it when we went longer distances. A familiar car pulled up outside. Dr. Harris climbed out, dressed simply in a patterned shirt and slacks instead of his white coat. I hugged him at the door and brought him out to the porch where David poured him tea. "So," David said after some small talk, "it's official." Harris smiled. "Official," he confirmed. "I finished my residency, and the hospital's new board just appointed me head of the Ethics and Quality Committee. After what happened, they wanted someone who'd actually speak up if things go wrong." "They chose the right person," I said, meaning every word. "Someone who kept fighting when everyone else looked away." Harris shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I just did what any decent human being should," he replied. "You two did the hard part." He nodded at David. "How's the new venture?" David's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before all of this. "We had to dissolve Brightline," he said. "Too much dirty history. But I managed to save some legitimate assets that weren't tied to Brian's fraud. I'm starting again, smaller, cleaner. Just a little consulting firm for now." Harris tilted his head. "What's it called?" David reached over and took my hand. "Evening Glow," he said. I laughed softly. "You turned my old cheesy nickname into a business brand?" "Hey," he said, grinning. "It got us through my password, didn't it? That name reminded me who I was fighting for. It seems like a good name for a second chance." Harris raised his cup. "To Evening Glow," he said, "and to the people who refused to let the darkness win." We sat there as the sun slipped lower, painting the sky orange, then pink, then a deep, peaceful purple. The worst days of our lives had shown us the ugliest sides of human nature: greed, betrayal, cruelty disguised as care. But they'd also revealed something else: Courage in a young doctor who refused to stay quiet, resilience in a man who fought his way back from a living grave, and a love stubborn enough to run through hospital corridors and hide in closets and face down killers. We had our lives back, not as they were before, but as something new and hard-won. A second life, born out of terror and built on truth. And if you stayed with us until this last ray of light, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place.